Welcome, everybody. As night settles in, let's dive into the pages of time, unfolding another story from the past. Maybe you're already laying in bed, or simply letting history keep you company. Where are you listening from tonight? Leave a comment if you'd like. I always enjoy hearing about your corner of the world. And if these gentle tales of lives long ago bring you comfort and rest, I'd be honored to have you stay with me by subscribing this channel. So let's begin. A history of the Order of Assassins. The wind that sweeps down from the snow-capped peaks of the Alborz Mountains is a blade of ice scouring the high valleys of Persia. It is a land of stark, terrible beauty, where the very air feels thin with age and secrecy. Here, in the 11th century, the great empires of the Seljuk Turks and the Fatimid caliphs clashed, their armies like tides washing across the plains. But in the mountains, a different kind of power was being born, a power not of armies, but of a single, unwavering will. Our story begins not with a battle, but with a schism. In the year 1090, a man named Hassan I-Sabah, a charismatic and fiercely intelligent Ismaili Shura preacher, sought a fortress from which to proclaim the authority of his imam. His gaze fell upon Alamut, the eagle's nest. It was not a castle in the European sense, a seat of feudal power. It was a geological aberration, a spine of rock jutting from a narrow valley, its summit a sheer, inaccessible plateau. The story goes that Hassan, assessing its impregnability, declared, "The stone itself is its own garrison." He did not take it by storm, but by a masterstroke of stealth and patience. For months, his followers, disguised as laborers and scholars, infiltrated the fortress, then held by a minor Seljuk-aligned lord. They worked, they preached, they won hearts and minds. On a chosen day, Hassan himself entered unseen. From a hidden position, he watched as his followers, at a prearranged signal, seized the gates without shedding a single drop of blood. The commander of the garrison awoke to find his stronghold no longer his own. He was offered a generous purse and safe passage. He took it. The eagle's nest had been taken by the shadow, and the shadow would now cast its darkness across the world. This was the genesis of the order that would become known as the Hashashin, the Assassins. They would not build an empire of territory, but an empire of fear. They would not command armies, but minds. For nearly 2 centuries, from their mountain fortresses, they would defy the greatest powers of the age, their name becoming a whisper of death that could silence sultans in their own throne rooms. This is their story. The Master of Alamut. The wind that found its way through the arrow slits of Alamut's highest chamber was a relentless, whispering force. It carried with it the scent of high-altitude pine and the dry, cold dust of the rocky slopes far below. This chamber was not a throne room. There were no silken cushions, no gilded ornaments, no piles of plundered treasure. The floor was bare, polished stone, cold to the touch. The walls were lined with simple wooden shelves, bowed under the weight of scrolls and codices bound in worn leather. The only furniture was a low writing desk, its surface a chaotic landscape of ink pots, astrolabes, half-unrolled maps, and sheets of paper covered in a precise, angular script. This was the sanctuary of Hassan I-Sabah, the man who would become known to the world as the Old Man of the Mountain. He sat cross-legged on a thin reed mat, his back straight, his movements economical. He was not an old man yet, but his presence carried the weight of ages. His face was a study in asceticism. High cheekbones stretched tight over a lean frame, a beard of black shot through with early silver, trimmed with a geometric precision that spoke of a mind intolerant of chaos. But it was his eyes that commanded the room. They were the color of dark obsidian, and they held a stillness that was both intellectual and terrifying. They missed nothing, absorbed everything, and gave nothing back. He was reading a treatise on Neoplatonic philosophy, his finger tracing the lines of text, but his mind was elsewhere, building an empire of an entirely new kind. The conquest of Alamut had been the easy part. The real work began now. The fortress was not an end. It was a symbol, a statement carved into the very bedrock of the Alborz Mountains. Its message was one of defiance and unassailable truth. From this eagle's nest, he would not launch fleets or legions. He would launch ideas, and those ideas would be enforced with the point of dagger. His first command, issued within hours of securing the fortress, had been for the architects and engineers. The granaries, he had said, his voice soft but absolute. They must hold a 5-year supply of grain, barley, and dried legumes. The cisterns must be hewn deeper, lined with the finest lime plaster. We must be able to withstand a siege that lasts a generation. He understood that true power lay not in the ability to attack, but in the absolute capacity to endure. A fortress that could not be starved was a fortress that could not be taken. Next came the library. He dispatched agents with seemingly limitless funds to the great cities of the Muslim world, Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus. They were to acquire every significant text they could find, not just the Quran and Hadith, but works of Greek logic, Hindu mathematics, Persian poetry, and esoteric mystical tracts. Knowledge was the second wall of his fortress. A fight-in must be more than a blind fanatic. He must be a scholar, able to debate a Sunni alim or a Christian philosopher, to understand the mind of his enemy before he ever slipped a dagger between his ribs. But his most audacious project was the one he supervised personally in a secluded courtyard on the southern face of the mountain, shielded from the view of the valley by a sheer overhang. Here, he created the Jannat al-Bustan, the Garden of the Orchard. It was an engineering marvel. Soil was carried up the mountain on the backs of men and mules. Aqueducts and hidden pipes brought water from the melting snows of the highest peaks. He planted cherry and apricot trees, vines heavy with grapes, beds of roses and jasmine, whose perfume hung thick in the enclosed air. Pavilions of delicate wood and silk were constructed, and he selected a small group of attendants, young men and women of exceptional beauty and grace, trained in music, poetry, and the art of conversation. This garden was not for his pleasure. He was said to never set foot in it after its completion. It was a tool, a psychological instrument of breathtaking sophistication. His rule was one of ironclad discipline, applied first and most harshly to himself and his own family. The story of his 2 sons was a legend whispered with fear and awe within Alamut's walls. His eldest, accused of drunkenness and violating the community's laws, was brought before him. There was no public trial, no emotional appeal. Hassan listened to the evidence, his face a mask of stone. The sentence was death. His followers pleaded for mercy. Hassan reportedly replied, "The law is a single flame. If I allow the wind of favoritism to touch it, even for my own blood, the entire fire will be extinguished." The execution was carried out. Later, a second son was suspected of plotting against him. The evidence was circumstantial, but for Hassan, suspicion was a cancer that had to be cut out. That son too was killed. The message was unequivocal. The cause, the dawah, was everything. The individual was nothing. It was from this crucible of absolute discipline and high-minded ideology that the doctrine of the fight-in was forged. The recruits, boys in their early teens, were chosen not for brute strength, but for intelligence, piety, and a certain pliability of spirit. Their training was a multi-year odyssey. The first stage was intellectual. They were taught to read and write, to memorize vast passages of the Quran and the specific Ismaili interpretations penned by Hassan himself. They learned the art of dialectic, jadal asterisk, so they could defend their faith and dismantle the arguments of others. They studied geography, the customs of different cities, and the languages of their enemies: Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and even the Frankish tongue of the Crusaders. The second stage was physical and practical. They trained for hours each day, building endurance, learning to move with a silent, fluid grace. They became masters of disguise, learning to blend into the bustling souks of Damascus or the royal courts of Isfahan. They were taught the use of many weapons, but the dagger was emphasized above all. It was a personal weapon. Using it meant entering the victim's intimate space, close enough to smell their perfume or their sweat. It was a weapon of absolute commitment, with no chance of a second strike. It was also a weapon of statement. It demonstrated that the assassin could reach anyone, anywhere. But the final, culminating stage was psychological. After years of preparation, the chosen Fadain would be summoned for a private audience with one of Hassan's chief deputies. He would be given a task of immense importance, a test of his loyalty. Upon agreeing, he would be offered a sweetened drink. Unbeknownst to him, it was laced with a powerful opiate. He would awaken in a state of disoriented bliss. The world had transformed. He was in the Jannat al-Bustan. The air was warm and scented. Beautiful attendants would offer him succulent fruits and sweet wines. They would speak to him of divine favor, telling him he was experiencing a foretaste of the paradise promised to the faithful. The experience was a full sensory assault, a day and night of perfect, sensual happiness. Then the opiate would be administered again. He would awake, groggy and confused, back in his sparse cell in the fortress barracks. The deputy would be there, his expression serene. "You have tasted the reward that awaits you," he would say softly. "The master has shown you the truth of the afterlife. Through absolute obedience, through the ultimate sacrifice, that garden will be yours for eternity. Your life here is nothing. The life to come is everything." The effect was transformative. The memory of the garden was not a dream. It was a visceral, haunting reality. The austere world of Alamut became a temporary illusion. The only path back to that paradise was through the will of Hassan Sabah. The young man was no longer just a devout follower. He was a metaphysical soldier, a citizen of the next world temporarily residing in this one. He was now a Fadain in truth, one who sacrifices himself. His will was no longer his own. It was a weapon, perfectly crafted, awaiting its target. And Hassan Sabah, the master of Alamut, had just begun to take aim at the world. The dagger's message. The city of Nishapur, in the heart of the Seljuk Empire, was a jewel of the civilized world. Its bazaars overflowed with spices from India, silks from China, and manuscript from the great libraries of Baghdad. The air hummed with the chatter of merchants, scholars, and pilgrims. It was here, in the year 1092, that the assassins would deliver their first earth-shattering pronouncement to the powers of the age. The target was Nizam al-Mulk, the Grand Vizier of the Seljuk Empire, a man of immense intellect and administrative genius. He was the true architect of the empire's power, the good vizier of legend. But to Hassan Sabah, he was the primary obstacle to the Ismaili cause, a ruthless persecutor of their faith. The Fadain chosen for this inaugural mission was a young man named Butahir Irani. He had spent 3 years in Alamut, his mind sharpened by theology, his body hardened by training, his spirit irrevocably bound by the memory of the Paradise Garden. He was dispatched not as a warrior, but as a Sufi ascetic, his head shaved, his body clad in the coarse, woolen robe of a wandering dervish. He traveled the long road from the Alborz to Nishapur, his mind a fortress of purpose, his only weapon a slender, curved dagger concealed within his ragged garments. For weeks, Tahir observed. He learned the rhythms of the vizier's court. He noted how Nizam al-Mulk, despite his vast power, maintained a public display of piety and accessibility. Every Friday, after prayers, he would travel from the great mosque back to his palace in an open litter, allowing the common people to approach him with petitions. This was his strength, and it would be his undoing. The chosen day dawned clear and bright. The streets of Nishapur were packed. Tahir moved through the crowd with the current, his head bowed, his lips moving in silent prayer. His heart was not pounding with fear, but beating a slow, steady rhythm of certainty. He was not an assassin creeping towards his victim. He was a divine instrument moving towards a preordained moment. The memory of the scented garden, the taste of the cool wine, the sound of the lute, it was all more real to him than the dust and sweat of the street. As the vizier's litter drew near, the crowd pressed forward. Guards flanked the procession, their eyes scanning for obvious threats. They saw only a humble dervish, his face a mask of devotion. Tahir did not rush. He did not make a sudden lunge. He simply allowed the tide of the crowd to carry him to the very side of the litter. He looked up, and for a fleeting second, his eyes met those of Nizam al-Mulk. The old vizier saw not a killer, but a supplicant. In one fluid, almost graceful motion, Tahir drew the dagger from his robe. There was no battle cry, no shout of rage. The movement was as calm and deliberate as a priest performing a rite. He plunged the blade deep into the vizier's chest. The crowd froze for a moment, a collective intake of breath, before erupting into screams. The guards, shocked into action, fell upon the fighting. Tahir made no attempt to flee. He stood over his victim, his task complete, and let the soldiers' swords cut him down. He died with a beatific smile on his face, already seeing the gates of the garden swinging open. The assassination of Nizam al-Mulk sent a seismic shock through the Islamic world. It was not the death of a general in battle, which was a risk of the profession. This was the cold-blooded murder of the most powerful civilian in the empire, in broad daylight, surrounded by his guards. The message was not just political, it was psychological. It declared that no one, no matter how high their station or how strong their guard, was safe. The dagger had become a universal arbiter of power. The Seljuk Sultan, Malik Shah, was enraged and terrified. He vowed to wipe the heretics from their mountain lairs. He dispatched army after army to besiege Alamat. But Hassan I Sabah had prepared for this. The granaries were full, the cisterns overflowed. The Seljuk armies, accustomed to set-piece battles on open plains, withered in the harsh mountain climate. They camped in the valleys below, watching the impregnable fortress, while from its heights, the assassins watched them back, their resolve unshaken. The first test of the order had been passed. They had struck the lion in its den, and the lion, for all its roaring, could not reach them. The dagger's message had been received, and it would be repeated again and again until the very name assassin became a synonym for an inescapable death. The siege of the soul. The Seljuk armies that encircled Alamat were like a slow, metallic serpent coiling around the base of the mountain. From the high battlements, the assassins watched the glint of sun on spear tips, the lazy swirl of campfire smoke from the siege lines below. The air, once filled with the crisp silence of the high peaks, now carried the distant, discordant sounds of an army at rest. The hammering of siege engines, the shouts of officers, the lowing of oxen dragging supply carts. For the inhabitants of the fortress, it was a constant, grim reminder of the world's enmity. Inside his austere chamber, Hassanai Sabah remained unmoved. The siege was not a crisis, it was a validation. It proved the empire saw him as a threat. He walked the walls daily, his figure a familiar, skeletal silhouette against the sky. His presence was a tonic to the defenders. He showed no fear, no anxiety, only a cold, calculating calm. He would point out the disorganization in the Seljuk supply lines, the poor placement of their latrines, predicting the dysentery that would soon sweep through their ranks. He was not just a spiritual leader. He was a master of logistics and psychological warfare. He turned the siege into a prolonged lesson for his followers. They believe they are besieging stone, he told his inner circle, his voice barely a whisper in the wind. But stone can endure. It is their own will that is perishable. An army is a beast that must be fed. Its morale is a fire that must be constantly stoked. We need only wait. Our walls are not made of rock, but of faith. And wait they did. The seasons turned. The siege, intended to be a swift, crushing blow, stretched into months, then years. The Seljuk soldiers, bored, cold, and disease-ridden, grew to fear the mountain more than they desired its conquest. The assassins, in contrast, thrived in their isolation. The library was busy with scribes and students. The training of the Fidarin continued with relentless discipline. The granaries, built on Hassan's specific orders, remained plentiful. The siege was not a hardship. It was a purification. It was during this time that Hassan perfected his most potent weapon, targeted assassination as strategic deterrence. He understood that to break the siege, he did not need to defeat the army at his gates. He needed to break the will of the man who had sent it. A Fidain was chosen. His mission was not to infiltrate the camp below, but to travel hundreds of miles to the Seljuk capital of Isfahan, to the very heart of Sultan Malik Shah's power. The young man, whose name is lost to history, was prepared with a care that bordered on the sacramental. He was given the identity of a Turkish slave soldier, a ghulam, seeking service in the imperial guard. His training in language and custom was flawless. Weeks later, he stood in the bustling courtyard of the Sultan's palace in Isfahan. He had gained entry not through force, but through patient, humble service. He kept his head down, performed his duties impeccably, and waited. His moment came on a morning when Malik Shah was holding a semi-public audience. The Sultan, confident in his security, was surrounded by a ring of his most trusted guards. The Fidain approached, holding a petition, his eyes downcast. As he knelt before the Sultan, he did not produce a dagger. Instead, he looked up, and his voice, clear and steady, cut through the formal murmur of the court. "O Sultan," he said, his words echoing in the sudden silence. "The master of Alamut, Hassanai Sabah, sends you greetings. He wishes you to know that the hand which rests on this petition could just as easily hold a dagger. Your armies camp at our feet, yet we walk in your very bedchamber. Call off your dogs, or the next messenger will not be so courteous." Before the stunned guards could react, the Fidain drew a small, sharp knife from his belt. But he did not lunge at the Sultan. In a final, shocking act of theater, he plunged the blade into his own heart, collapsing at Malik Shah's feet. The message was delivered not with a threat of murder, but with a demonstration of the absolute, terrifying commitment of the man who served the old man of the mountain. The psychological impact on Malik Shah was profound. The siege, a distant military affair, had now reached into his throne room. The war was no longer at Alamut's gates. It was at his own. The sense of security that enveloped a mighty sovereign was shattered. He began to see assassins in every shadow, distrust in every courtier's face. The cost of subduing a single mountain fortress suddenly seemed infinitely higher. Soon after, the orders were sent. The Seljuk army, after years of futile encampment, broke camp and retreated from Alamut. They left behind the skeletal remains of their siege engines and the graves of those who had died from disease and despair. On the walls of the fortress, Hassanai Sabah watched them go, his expression unchanged. The siege was over. The assassins had not won a military victory. They had won a victory of the soul. They had proven that a single, unwavering will, projected through the terrifying instrument of the Phidian, could humble the greatest empire on earth. The legend of Alamut's invincibility was now sealed in the minds of friend and foe alike. The Poison Chalice. The death of Sultan Malik Shah, just weeks after the lifting of the siege of Alamut, sent the Seljuk Empire spiraling into a vortex of civil war. To the outside world, it was a sudden illness, a tragic twist of fate that toppled a giant. But within the silent halls of Alamut, it was recorded as another strategic victory, a testament to the far-reaching power of the order. The Phidian who had confronted the Sultan had not merely delivered a message. He had planted a seed of existential dread that, some whispered, had curdled the Sultan's own health. Whether by blade, by poison, or by sheer psychological terror, the assassins had reached from his mountain fastness and touched the very pinnacle of temporal power. This period of Seljuk fragmentation was the fertile ground in which Hassanai Sabah's network truly took root. He was no longer just the defiant lord of a single fortress. He was the spider at the center of a web that stretched across Persia and into Syria. New strongholds were established. Lamsar, a fortress of immense size and strength. Meymundiz, a castle perched on a needle of rock. And in Syria, the citadel of Masyaf, which would become the order's new nerve center in the Levant. Each was a smaller reflection of Alamut, self-sufficient, disciplined, and ruled by a trusted Dai who reported directly to the old man. It was during this expansion that the order faced its first great internal threat. A powerful and ambitious Dai, Hussein Al-Khani, stationed at the key fortress of Girdku, began to see himself not as a servant of the cause, but as a rival to Hassan. He commanded loyalty from his own men and controlled a vital node in the network. The challenge was not one of open rebellion. That would have been simple to crush. It was a subtle poison of ambition and divided loyalty, a cancer that could metastasize and destroy the order from within. Hassanai Sabah's response was a masterpiece of political and psychological execution. He did not send an army. He did not issue a public denunciation. He sent a single man, a senior Phidian named Abu Muslim, known for his piety and his unshakable loyalty. Abu Muslim was not sent to kill Hussein al-Quwaini. He was sent to join him. Arriving at Girdku, Abu Muslim presented himself as a devout follower disillusioned with Hassan's increasingly rigid and remote rule. He spoke of Hassan's failing health, his paranoia, his execution of his own sons. He skillfully played upon Hussein's ambition, feeding it with tales of other deists who were ready to support him as the new leader. For weeks, Abu Muslim embedded himself in Hussein's inner circle, a model of loyalty and strategic insight. He became the Dai's most trusted confidant, his counsel sought on all matters. One evening, during a private meal in Hussein's chambers, Abu Muslim produced a small, sealed letter. "This, my lord," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial, is from the commander of Lamsar. He pledges his fortress and his sword to you. The time to act is now. As Hussein al-Kini eagerly broke the seal and bent his head to read the forged message, his guard was completely down. He was surrounded by his own guards, in the heart of his own fortress, with his most loyal new advisor at his side. In that moment of triumphant anticipation, Abu Muslim drew his dagger. The movement was not the swift, public strike of Butahir into Shaper. It was an intimate, almost surgical act. He placed one hand on the Dai's shoulder, as if in camaraderie, and with the other, he drove the blade upwards, under the rib cage and into the heart. Hussein died without a cry, his ambition extinguished before it could fully ignite. Abu Muslim made no attempt to escape. He stood over the body, his hands raised, as the stunned guards rushed in. "The master of Alamut has passed judgment," he declared calmly. "The traitor is dead. The cause remains pure. My life is forfeit, as it has been since the day I accepted this mission." The news of Hussein's death and the manner of its execution reverberated through every assassin stronghold. The message was even more potent than the killing of Nizam al-Mulk. It declared that no one, not even a powerful Dai in his own fortress, was beyond the reach of Hassan's justice. Loyalty was not a matter of convenience or ambition. It was an absolute, and its violation was a death sentence delivered by the most unexpected hand. The poisoned chalice of rebellion had been offered, and it had proven to be fatal. The unity of the order, forged in the fires of the siege, and now tempered by this internal purge, became stronger than ever. Hassan I-Sabah had proven he could not only defy empires, but he could also command the very souls of his followers, ensuring that his will would be done, even in his absence. The Frankish Devil. The news that reached Alamut in the final years of the 11th century was at once terrifying and perplexing. A new, alien power had erupted onto the stage of the Levant. They were the Frange, the Crusaders, armored giants from the distant, rainy lands of Europe, driven by a fanaticism that rivaled the Fidesz. They had stormed Antioch, and in 1099, they had done the unthinkable. They had captured Jerusalem, bathing its holy stones in the blood of its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. In his chamber, Hassan I-Sabah pored over the reports brought by his agents. These Franks were unlike any enemy he had studied. They did not operate by the intricate rules of Seljuk politics or Abbasid diplomacy. Their motives were a crude fusion of greed and a strange, militant religion that seemed to grant absolution for any atrocity. They were a blunt instrument, and their presence shattered the delicate balance of power in Syria, a region where the assassins were still establishing their foothold. Hassan recognized a dual threat. The Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, were a direct military and ideological enemy. But they also presented an opportunity. The Sunni Muslim rulers of Damascus and Aleppo, who had hitherto viewed the Ismaili assassins as heretics to be suppressed, were now desperate for any ally against the Frankish onslaught. The chaos was a cloak the order could use to solidify its position. The first major encounter between the two most disciplined forces in the Levant was not on a battlefield, but in the shadows of a Crusader castle. Conrad of Montferrat, a brilliant, arrogant, and ambitious Italian nobleman, had become the de facto ruler of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He was a formidable opponent, a master of fortification and politics. To the assassins, he represented the sharpest edge of the Frankish threat. The Fidesz sent to deal with Conrad was a master of disguise, a man who had learned not just the Frankish tongue, but their mannerisms their piety, their very way of thinking. For months, he served in Conrad's own household in the city of Tyre, a humble, devout Latin Christian scribe. He attended Mass, he crossed himself, he gained the trust of the court. He learned that Conrad, despite his power, had one point of vulnerability: his piety. He regularly visited a certain bishop for private confession. On a spring day in 1192, as Conrad of Montferrat walked through a narrow street after leaving the bishop's residence, two men approached him. They were dressed as Christian monks, their cowls pulled low over their faces. They did not brandish weapons or shout curses. They simply bowed, as if in respect. As Conrad acknowledged them, they straightened up, and in a single, synchronized motion, they produced daggers and stabbed him repeatedly. Before the guards could even draw their swords, the assassins were upon Conrad, their blades finding their mark with clinical precision. They made no attempt to flee. They were immediately cut down, their true identities and motives dying with them. The assassination sent a shockwave through the Crusader states. If the assassins could kill the most powerful man in the kingdom, in his own city, disguised as monks, then no one was safe. A legend was born among the Franks of a mysterious old man in the mountain who commanded fanatical killers. A legend that would be recorded with a mixture of horror and fascination by chroniclers like William of Tyre. But the killing of Conrad was more than just a strike against a Frankish leader. It was a statement to the Muslim world. The assassins, the persecuted Ismaili heretics, had done what the great Sunni armies of Saladin had failed to do. They had decapitated the Frankish leadership. It granted them a new, fearsome prestige. Soon, embassies from both Crusader and Muslim rulers were making the treacherous journey to the assassin strongholds, bearing gifts and seeking alliances, or at least a promise of non-aggression. The order had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of the Levant, playing both sides against each other, using the fear of their daggers to carve out a space for their own survival and power. The Frankish devil had been met, and in the dark alleys of Tyre, the assassins had proven they were the master of the shadow war. The Sultan's bargain. The dust of the Syrian desert tasted of chalk and heat. In the year 1176, the greatest army the Muslim world had seen in a generation was on the march. Its commander was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Saladin, the unifier of Egypt and Syria, the hope of Sunni Islam, the man who had vowed to sweep the Crusader states into the sea. His goal was not a Frankish fortress, but an Ismaili one, Masyaf, the Syrian heart of the assassin order. He saw them as a poisonous thorn in the side of Muslim unity, a heretical sect whose loyalty was to their hidden imam, not to the cause of jihad. From the walls of Masyaf, the assassin sentinels watched the approach of this human avalanche. The air, usually clear and silent but for the cry of eagles, now vibrated with the distant, metallic rumble of an army. The sun glinted off a forest of lances and the polished helmets of the Mamluks, Saladin's elite slave soldiers. The Grand Master of Masyaf, Rashid ad-Din Sinan, known to his followers as Sheikh al-Jabal, the old man of the mountain, observed the scene with his characteristic, unnerving calm. He was a contemporary of Saladin, a man of immense learning and charisma, and he understood that this was a battle he could not win with steel alone. Saladin's siege was swift and professional. His engineers began constructing trebuchets. His archers loosed clouds of arrows to pin down the defenders. He was confident. He had broken stronger walls than these. But that first night, as he slept in his command tent, surrounded by a ring of his most trusted guards, something impossible happened. He awoke with a start. The air in the tent was still. A single lamp guttered, casting long, dancing shadows. And there, on the carpet beside his bed, was a dagger. It was not a common soldier's weapon. It was the distinctive, curved dagger of the fighting. Pinned beneath it was a small, folded piece of parchment. His heart hammering against his ribs, Saladin snatched it up. The message was simple, written in elegant Arabic script. Asterisk, you are safe in our care. You are not safe from our care. The next one will not be a warning. Asterisk, a cold dread, more profound than any he had felt on the battlefield, seeped into him. He had been invulnerable, at the center of his power. And yet, an assassin had been in his very tent, had stood over him as he slept, and had left a message instead of taking his life. The message was not just a threat. It was a demonstration of power, so absolute it bordered on the supernatural. His guards were useless. His army was irrelevant. The assassin could reach him anywhere. The following day, the siege continued, but Saladin's heart was no longer in it. His officers noted his preoccupation, the distant look in his eyes. That evening, a lone figure, unarmed and dressed in simple white robes, was seen walking calmly from the gates of Masyaf towards the Seljuk lines. It was an emissary from Sinan. The man was brought before Saladin. He did not bow. He spoke with a quiet authority. The Sheikh Al-Jabal sends greetings. He asked what you hope to gain by this siege. You waste men and resources that could be used against the true enemy, the Franks. We are not your foe, O Sultan, unless you make us one. Continue this path, and you will spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. End it, and you will have our neutrality. The bargain was struck not in a grand treaty hall, but in the mind of a sultan who had just been shown his own mortality. Saladin, the great champion of Islam, was forced to acknowledge the power of the Ismaili heresy. He broke camp and withdrew his army from Masyaf. He never again moved against the assassins. In fact, a strange, unspoken understanding emerged. Some chroniclers even suggest that Saladin later employed assassin agents to eliminate his own troublesome rivals. The lesson of Masyaf echoed the lesson of Alamut. The order could not defeat a great empire in open war, but it could terrify its emperor into a standstill. They had forced Saladin, the man who would reclaim Jerusalem, to bargain with them. They had turned the Sultan's own sense of invincibility against him, proving that the most powerful weapon was not the army at one's command, but the fear planted in one's soul. The Sultan's bargain was not a victory of arms, but a triumph of psychological warfare, a testament to the fact that the shadow of the dagger could be longer and far more persuasive than the sword. The whispers of heresy. The air within the great library of Alamut was a sacred silence, thick with the scent of aging paper, leather bindings, and a faint, floral note of ink. This was the mind of the order, a repository of knowledge more carefully guarded than any treasury. But in the later years of Hassan I Sabbah's life, a new and dangerous idea began to whisper through these hallowed halls, an intellectual current that would threaten to tear the order apart from the inside. It was the doctrine of Talim, taken to its most radical, world-shattering conclusion. Hassan, ever the intellectual, had always surrounded himself with the most brilliant minds of the Ismaili faith. Among them was a philosopher-poet of extraordinary charisma and radical thought. He argued that if the die was the infallible representative of the Imam, and his word was law, then the literal commandments of the Quran, the Zahir or exoteric form, could be set aside in favor of the batin, the esoteric, hidden truth known only to the initiated. This was not entirely new, but he pushed it further. He began to teach that for those who had reached the highest level of understanding, the Hakkaiq, the spiritual laws had replaced the physical ones. The Ramadan fast, the 5 daily prayers, these were but shadows for the unenlightened. For the true adept, they were no longer binding. The implications were explosive. This was not just theological debate. It was a threat to the very discipline that held the order together. The rigorous daily prayers, the strict observance of Islamic law, even in its Ismaili interpretation, were the bedrock of the Fidayans' discipline. They provided the structure, the sense of sacred purpose that channeled their fanaticism. To remove that structure was to risk unleashing pure, undirected anarchy. Hassan-I Sabbah, though a revolutionary, was a pragmatist above all else. He saw the danger immediately. This heresy, for it was heresy even by his own rigorous standards, could corrode the absolute obedience he demanded. A Fidayyan who believed he was above the law was a Fidayyan who could no longer be controlled. The philosopher-poet and his most ardent followers were summoned. The confrontation did not take place in the public court, but in Hassan's private chamber. The philosopher, confident in his logic and his following, made his case with eloquent passion. He spoke of spiritual freedom, of transcending the mundane to grasp the divine reality. Hassan listened, his obsidian eyes fixed on the man, his face a mask of granite. When the philosopher finished, there was a long, heavy silence. "Your words are beautiful," Hassan said, his voice dangerously soft. "They are like a finely crafted sword, but a sword without a hilt cuts the hand that wields it. You speak of freedom from law, but you offer only the freedom to fall. The Fidayyan does not need to be freed from the law. He needs the law to give his sacrifice meaning. Without the structure of devotion, his death is mere murder, his courage mere savagery." He stood, his thin frame seeming to tower in the small room. "You have confused enlightenment with license. You have mistaken a map for the territory. And in doing so, you have become a poison in the well from which my followers drink." The sentence was swift and absolute. There would be no public debate, no chance for his ideas to spread further. The philosopher-poet and his inner circle were taken to the deepest dungeon of Alamut. They were not tortured or made martyrs. They were simply erased. They were given food and water, but they would never see the sun again, their dangerous ideas entombed with them in the living silence of the rock. Their writings were sought out and burned, the ashes scattered from the highest tower. The purge was quiet, thorough, and merciless. It demonstrated a crucial aspect of Hassan's leadership. He was not a mere fanatic. He was a master ideologue. He understood that the power of the order lay in the perfect, brittle fusion of absolute spiritual certainty and absolute temporal discipline. The whispers of heresy had threatened to decouple these two forces, and Hassan had crushed them without a moment's hesitation. The mind of Alamut had to be as unified and impregnable as its walls. The purity of the cause, as he defined it, was non-negotiable. It was a lesson in intellectual tyranny that would echo through the centuries, a stark reminder that the most dangerous enemies often arise not from without, but from within the fortress of one's own beliefs. The shadow war for a throne. The great Seljuk Empire, which had once sent armies to crush Alamut, was now a carcass being torn apart by rival warlords and princes. In the city of Salve, a new power was rising. Sanjar, son of Malik Shah, a prince of immense ambition who sought to reunite the shards of his father's domain. His rise was a direct threat to the order's hard-won autonomy. A strong, unified Seljuk Sultanate would inevitably turn its gaze back to the heretical statelet in the Alborz Mountains. Hassan-I Sabbah, now an old man whose body was frail, but whose will remain forged of iron, saw the threat with perfect clarity. He would not meet this challenge with armies he did not have, but with the weapon he had perfected, the strategic elimination of a single, pivotal individual. The target was not Sanjar himself. To kill a rising prince would only create a martyr and invite overwhelming retaliation. The target was the source of his power, Abu el-Fath Mu'ayyid al-Mulk, Sanjar's Grand Vizier and the brilliant political architect of his nascent regime. The Fidayeen chosen for this mission was a young man named Yusuf. His training had been the most comprehensive yet. He was not merely a dervish or a slave. He was a scholar, capable of debating jurisprudence and philosophy with the ulama in Sanjar's court. He infiltrated Save not as a menial, but as a minor functionary in the vizier's own bureaucracy, a humble scribe with a prodigious memory and a neat hand. For months, Yusuf worked. He was diligent, unobtrusive, and invaluable. He learned the labyrinthine corridors of power, the schedules of the guards, the vizier's habits. Al-Mulk was a cautious man, protected by layers of loyal guards. He never traveled without a heavily armed escort. His food was tasted. His chambers were secure. But Hassan I Sabah had taught his followers that every man, no matter how powerful, has a moment of vulnerability. For the vizier, it was his piety. Every Friday, without fail, Abu el-Fath Mu'ayyid al-Mulk would leave the citadel to lead prayers at the great mosque of Save. It was a public display of his virtue and his connection to the people. The route was always the same, lined with spectators and soldiers. It was here, in the very heart of his power, surrounded by his people and his guards, that he felt safest. It was here he was most exposed. The plan was one of breathtaking audacity. It required not one, but two fight-in. Yusuf would be the striker. The second, older agent, posing as a blind beggar, would take up a permanent position at a specific point along the route, his presence so constant he became part of the scenery. On the appointed day, the procession moved through the crowded streets. The vizier, seated on a fine horse, nodded to the crowds, his mind on matters of state. As he passed the blind beggar, the old man, with a precision born of a lifetime of training, gave an almost imperceptible signal, a slight tilt of his head. It was the trigger. Yusuf, who had positioned himself in the front row of the crowd, did not leap forward. He simply stepped out, as if pushed by the press of bodies. He stumbled directly into the path of the vizier's horse. For a split second, all eyes were on the stumbling scholar. In that moment of collective distraction, Yusuf's hand moved. The dagger, concealed in the voluminous sleeve of his robe, flashed. It was not a wild stab, but a single, precise thrust upwards under the vizier's ribcage. Chaos erupted. The guard surged forward, grabbing Yusuf. He offered no resistance. He looked up at the dying vizier, their eyes meeting for a fleeting moment before the soldiers' swords cut him down. The second fight-in, the blind beggar, had already melted away into the panicked crowd, his mission as the spotter complete. The assassination of Abu al-Mulk did not just kill a man, it killed a political movement. Sanjar's court, deprived of its administrative genius, descended into factional infighting. The campaign to reunify the Seljuk heartland stalled, then collapsed. The prince was forced to turn his attention inward to secure his own position, his dreams of empire indefinitely postponed. The message to every would-be sultan and shah was unequivocal. The Order of Assassins was not just a local nuisance. It was a geopolitical player. They could reach into the most secure chambers of power and, with a single, well-placed stroke, alter the destiny of nations. They could not build a throne, but they could ensure that a rival's throne was never built. The shadow war for the Seljuk throne had been won not on a battlefield, but on a dusty street in Save, with a whisper and a sliver of steel. The cost was 2 lives. The prize was another century of freedom. The passing of the shadow. The cold of the Alborz winter in 1124 seemed to seep into the very stones of Alamut, a deep, penetrating chill that no brazier could fully dispel. Hassan-I Sabah, the man who had defied empires and forged a legend from will and steel, was dying. He had not left his Spartan chamber for weeks. The body that had once housed such an indomitable spirit was now a withered shell, ravaged by age and a lifetime of immense intellectual and psychological strain. The news spread through the fortress in hushed, disbelieving tones. For many of the fight-in, Hassan was not merely a leader. He was a fixed point in the cosmos, as permanent and unchanging as the mountain itself. The idea of a world without his guiding will was terrifying. The atmosphere in Alamut grew heavy with a silent, collective anxiety. The wind whistling through the battlements sounded like a lament. In his final days, Hassan was as lucid and disciplined as ever. He summoned his most trusted deputies, the dais of the major strongholds. The scene in the chamber was stark. The old man lay on his simple pallet, wrapped in thin blankets, his breath a faint plume in the frigid air. His dark eyes, though sunken, still burned with their familiar intensity. There were no sentimental farewells, no deathbed revelations. This was a final strategic briefing. His voice was a dry rustle, but every word was precise and deliberate. "You have the system," he whispered, his gaze moving from one face to another. "The granaries are full. The cisterns will not run dry. The doctrines are written. The training must not falter." He paused, gathering the last of his strength. "Our strength has never been in these walls. It is in the belief of our enemies that we are everywhere. That belief is your true fortress. Guard it as you guard these gates." He then gave his final, most crucial command. He named his successor, not a son, for he had executed them, but the most capable of his deputies, a man known for his unwavering loyalty and administrative competence. "Bujer Gummid will lead you. Obey him as you have obeyed me. The cause transcends the man." With a succession clearly established to prevent a power struggle, Hassan-I Sabah closed his eyes. He did not speak again. He died as he had lived, with absolute control, his affairs in perfect order, his legacy secured. The news was announced to the sound of a single, mournful horn from the highest tower. The impact of his death was profound, but not chaotic. The system he had built held firm. Bujer Gummid assumed leadership seamlessly. The fight-in continued their training, the sentinels their watch. But something intangible had shifted. The genius, the unpredictable, terrifying intellect that had conceived the order was gone. What remained was the machine, perfectly constructed, but without its original, brilliant engineer. Hassan was buried in a simple, unmarked grave within the fortress, his resting place a secret to all but a few. There was no grand mausoleum. He had forbidden it. He understood that a tomb could become a shrine, and a shrine could become a target. His legacy was not to be a pile of stones, but the living, breathing, terrifying order he had created. The shadow he had cast was so long that it would continue to darken the world for generations, even after the source of the light had been extinguished. The old man of the mountain was dead, but the fear of the old man had just been born. The Syrian scepter. The death of Hassan-I Sabah sent a tremor through the assassin network, but in the Syrian stronghold of Masyaf, the news was met with a particular complex tension. The Syrian branch had always operated with a degree of autonomy, its challenges distinct from those in Persia. They navigated a fractured landscape of crusader states, rival Turkish Atabegs, and the rising power of Saladin. With the architect of the order gone, the man who ruled Masyaf saw not a void, but an opportunity. Rashid ad-Din Sinan, the Syrian old man of the mountain, was a leader cut from a different cloth than the austere Hassan. While just as ruthless and disciplined, Sinan possessed a flair for the dramatic, a mastery of theater that made him seem less a man and more a legend made flesh. He was rumored to perform miracles, to command the weather, to appear in two places at once. He cultivated an aura of divine authority that captivated his followers and terrified his enemies. Sinan's first great test was internal. A rival die within the Syrian branch, motivated by ambition and a belief that Sinan's esoteric teachings bordered on heresy, challenged his authority. This was not a war of armies, but a duel of faith. Sinan did not order the man's assassination. Instead, he summoned the entire community to the central courtyard of Masyaf. Before the assembled Fidoin and citizens, Sinan confronted his rival. "You question my connection to the divine." Sinan's voice was calm, carrying to the farthest corners of the courtyard. He pointed to a high, narrow tower that rose from the fortress walls, its summit a needle against the sky. "You see that tower? I will now throw myself from its peak. If God wills it, and my authority is true, I shall be unharmed. If not, you shall lead." A stunned silence fell over the crowd. The rival die, his confidence shaken, could only nod, trapped by his own challenge. Sinan, without another word, turned and climbed the long, winding stairs to the top of the tower. Every eye in Masyaf was fixed on that tiny, distant figure. For a long moment, he stood poised on the parapet. Then he stepped off. A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. Sinan fell, his white robes fluttering like the wings of a dying bird. He plummeted towards the unforgiving stone of the courtyard. And then, just as impact seemed inevitable, his fall was broken by a hidden awning, stretched between two lower buildings and concealed from the view of the crowd below. He landed, rolled, and stood up, brushing the dust from his robes as if he had merely stumbled. To the witnesses, it was not a trick, it was a miracle. The rival die fell to his knees, his rebellion shattered. Sinan walked through the prostrate crowd, his face serene. He had not just defeated a rival. He had transcended mere leadership. He was now, in the eyes of his followers, truly the Sheikh al-Jabal, a man touched by God. His authority in Syria became absolute, rooted in a perceived divinity that made Hassanai Sabah's logical discipline seem almost mundane. The Syrian scepter was now wielded by a miracle worker, and his legend would make the Frankish crusaders whisper his name with a dread that bordered on awe. The King's Terror. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, a fragile Frankish outpost on the edge of the Muslim world, was a kingdom perpetually on a war footing. Yet, its greatest fear was not the massed armies of Saladin, but the silent, unseen threat from the mountains. The legend of the old man of the mountain, of his fanatical Hashishiyin who feared no death, had curdled into a pervasive terror in the hearts of the Crusader nobility. They built high walls and kept strong guards, but they could not guard against a devotion so absolute it welcomed the grave. This terror found its most potent expression in the reign of Conrad of Montferrat, the brilliant and arrogant king of Jerusalem. He was a man who believed in the tangible, in stone walls, in sharp swords, in the power of his own lineage. The assassins were a phantom to him, a superstition of the desert. He dismissed them, and in his dismissal, he signed his own death warrant. Rashid ad-Din Sinan, from his eyrie in Masyaf, watched Conrad's rise. The king was a unifier, a strategist who could potentially rally the fractured crusader states into a cohesive, formidable force. He was a threat to the delicate balance of power Sinan so expertly manipulated. The order was given. The two fighting chosen were masters of their art. They did not infiltrate Conrad's court as scribes or servants. They became part of the very fabric of the holy city itself. For weeks, they lived as devout Latin monks, their piety flawless, their habits worn and familiar. They attended the church of the Holy Sepulchre, their heads bowed in prayer, their lips moving with the Latin liturgy. They became invisible. On a bright morning in 1192, Conrad was visiting the bishop of Tyre. The streets were crowded, the air thick with the smells of a thriving medieval city, baking bread, spices, and the underlying stench of humanity. The two monk assassins moved with the crowd, their steps slow and deliberate, their hands folded within the sleeves of their habits. They did not look at their target. They felt his presence, a predator's sense honed by years of training. As Conrad emerged from the bishop's residence, laughing at some remark, feeling secure in his own city, surrounded by his knights, the two monks approached. They did not run. They did not shout. They simply bowed, as if in benediction. Conrad, a pious man, acknowledged the gesture. It was his last. In a movement so fluid it seemed almost ceremonial, the two men straightened. Their hands emerged from their sleeves, no longer empty, but holding the wickedly curved daggers of the order. They did not stab wildly. They targeted the heart, the lungs, the great arteries. The blades sank deep. Conrad's laughter turned to a wet gurgle of shock. His knights, frozen for a fatal second by the sheer sacrilege of the act, watched their king slump to the dusty street, his blood pooling around the hem of a monk's robe. The assassins made no attempt to escape. They stood over their work, their faces serene, their daggers held ready, until the knights' swords cut them down. They died as they had lived, as instruments of a will far greater than their own. The assassination of Conrad of Montferrat sent a paroxysm of fear through every castle and court in Outremer. If the king of Jerusalem was not safe in his own city, dressed in the sanctity of a bishop's visit, then no one was safe. The terror was no longer an abstract fear. It was a cold certainty. The assassins were not just killers. They were a supernatural plague, a divine punishment. They could be the beggar at your gate, the monk in your chapel, the servant in your hall. The king's terror had proven that the most powerful throne was nothing but a target, and that the shadow of Alamut was long enough to darken the very steps of the Holy Sepulchre. The unholy accord. The sun beat down upon the stark, limestone hills surrounding the fortress of Masyaf. For years, a tense stalemate had existed between the assassins and the Knights Templar, the most powerful and militant of the Crusader military orders. The Templars, with their vast wealth and fanatical zeal, saw the Ismaili heretics as a blight to be cleansed. Skirmishes were frequent, a bloody, grinding conflict of ambush and reprisal in the ravines and passes of the Nozeri Mountains. For Rashid ad-Din Sinan, this war of attrition was a drain on his resources and a distraction from his greater geopolitical gains. He needed to neutralize the Templar threat, not necessarily through bloodshed, but through a more profound psychological victory. He devised a plan of breathtaking audacity, one that would demonstrate his power not by taking a life, but by commanding the will of his most hated enemies. The plan was set in motion not with a dagger, but with a whispered message delivered through a network of spies and turncoats to the highest levels of the Templar command. It was not a threat, but an invitation. An invitation for the Grand Master of the Templars himself to meet, in secret, with the old man of the mountain. The Templar leadership was outraged. The very idea was blasphemy. Treating with the devil? Yet, the chilling efficiency of the assassins, coupled with the memory of King Conrad's murder, gave them pause. Curiosity and a pragmatic fear won out. A delegation was sent, not to Masyaf, but to a neutral, isolated valley, its location known only to a few. The Templars arrived in full martial splendor, their white mantles with a displayed red cross a stark symbol of their faith. They were armored, armed, and suspicious. Sinan arrived with only a handful of attendants, dressed in simple white robes. The contrast was deliberate. He needed no armor. His power was of a different kind. The meeting was tense. The Templar commander, a grim-faced veteran of a dozen battles, demanded to know why he had been summoned. Sinan spoke calmly, his voice soft but carrying. He spoke not of war, but of cost. He detailed the financial toll the conflict was taking on the Templar treasury, the names of knights lost in ambushes, the caravan routes that were no longer safe. He knew their business better than they knew it themselves. Then he came to his point. This conflict serves neither of us, he said. You waste men and money fighting a shadow. I waste resources better spent elsewhere. Let's end it. The Templar commander scoffed. And how would you propose we do that? You will lay down your daggers. Sinan smiled, a thin, cold gesture. There is a simpler way. He gestured to one of his attendants, who stepped forward and placed a small, heavy chest on the ground between them. The lid was opened. Inside, nestled on dark velvet, was a fortune in gold dinars. A gesture of goodwill, Sinan said, and an annual tribute to follow. In return, you will grant my people safe passage. You will cease your attacks. We will have peace. The Templars were stunned. The assassins, the fanatical heretics, were offering them a bribe. It was an insult to their faith, their very reason for being. But the gold was real. The cost of the war was real. As they hesitated, torn between piety and pragmatism, Sinan delivered his masterstroke. He looked at the Templar commander, his gaze piercing. You think this is a negotiation? Look around you. The Templars glanced at the surrounding cliffs. There was nothing. Then, as if materializing from the very rock, figures stood up, dozens of them, fighting in, their white robes making them invisible against the limestone. They were on the cliffs above, on the passes behind them. They had been there the entire time, silent, unseen. The Templar delegation was not at a meeting. They were in a trap. They had been surrounded from the moment they arrived. You see, Sinan said, his voice still calm, I do not need to negotiate. I am offering you a choice. You can take the gold and have peace, or you can refuse, and your order will be left leaderless today. The choice is yours. The message was unmistakable. This was not a request. It was an ultimatum delivered from a position of absolute power. The Templars, men of war, understood force. Humbled and terrified, the Grand Master nodded his assent. The chest of gold was taken. The unholy accord was struck. For years, the Templars, the sworn defenders of Christendom, accepted an annual tribute from the assassin heretics. They turned a blind eye to their activities, granting them a de facto safe haven. The news, when it eventually leaked, was a scandal that rocked the Crusader states. It was Sinan's ultimate victory. He had not just defeated the Templars on the battlefield. He had corrupted them, proving that even the most fervent faith had a price, and that the true power of the assassin was not just to kill the body, but to compromise the soul. The Mongol storm. For nearly 2 centuries, The Order of Assassins had defied the greatest powers of Islam and Christendom. They had mastered the art of the small war, the psychological duel, the strategic murder. But in the middle of the 13th century, a new enemy emerged from the eastern steppes, an enemy against which their arts were useless. It was not an empire of laws and princes, but a force of nature, the Mongol horde. The first rumors that reached Alamut were fantastical, dismissed as travelers' tales. Stories of endless horsemen who lived in the saddle, who could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy at full gallop, and who showed mercy to none. The assassin spies, the finest in the world, soon confirmed the terrifying truth. Under the command of Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, a Mongol army of unprecedented size was moving west. Its mission, blessed by the great Khan, was the total annihilation of the Ismaili state. The then leader of the assassins, Imam Allah al-Din Muhammad, was a man of a different temperament than his predecessors. He was volatile, prone to paranoia, and fits of rage. As the Mongol storm gathered, he retreated into isolation, executing capable subordinates in suspicion, weakening the order from within at the very moment it needed unity. The sophisticated machine built by Hassan I Sabbah was beginning to rust. The Mongols did not operate by the rules of Seljuk or Abbasid warfare. They did not send vulnerable viziers or prideful sultans who could be reached by a dedicated fight-in. Hulagu Khan traveled with his entire court, a mobile city of felt tents, surrounded by a swarm of loyal, disciplined Tumans. Reaching him was a physical impossibility. The assassin's primary weapon was neutralized before the first arrow was fired. Hulagu's strategy was one of overwhelming, systematic force. He did not lay siege to a single fortress. He advanced methodically, reducing the outlying assassin strongholds one by one. The Mongols used their Chinese siege engineers to build trebuchets that could hurl massive stones for days on end, shattering walls that had never before been breached. They were masters of psychological terror, building pyramids of skulls from the inhabitants of conquered towns, a grisly warning to the next fortress on their path. The final act approached Alamut itself. The new Grandmaster, Rukn al-Din Kersha, a young and inexperienced leader who had succeeded his murdered father, watched in despair as the noose tightened. The Mongols surrounded the mountain, their numbers darkening the valleys. The legendary granaries and cisterns of Alamut, designed to outlast a decade-long siege, were meaningless against an enemy that could maintain a siege for as long as it took. Ina disperate zembit, Rukn al-Din chose negotiation. He descended from Alamut and surrendered to Hulagu Khan, hoping to save his people. It was a fatal miscalculation. The Mongols had not come to negotiate. They had come to erase. Rukn al-Din was used as a tool, forced to order the surrender of the remaining assassin fortresses. One by one, the proud citadels of the order, Lamsar, Meymundiz, and dozens of others, opened their gates. Once his usefulness was exhausted, Rukn al-Din was taken by the Mongols and, during the journey back to their capital, was kicked to death by his guards. His body was left by the roadside. The great library of Alamut, the accumulated knowledge and secret history of the order, was put to the torch. The priceless manuscripts, the theological works, the maps and star charts, all fed the flames, their ashes scattered by the mountain wind. The fortress itself was systematically slighted, its walls thrown down, its towers demolished. The Mongol storm had not been a war. It had been an extinction event. The assassins, who had mastered the art of killing individuals, were utterly destroyed by an enemy that thought only in terms of nations. The eagle's nest was desecrated, its secrets lost, its power broken forever on the anvil of a new, impersonal kind of warfare. The shadow that had stretched across 2 centuries was finally dispelled by a whirlwind from the east. The last echo at Masyaf. The news of Alamut's fall traveled across the Muslim world like a mournful wind. In the Syrian fortress of Masyaf, the last remaining heart of the dying order, the atmosphere was one of stunned disbelief, quickly hardening into grim resolve. The unthinkable had happened. The mother fortress was dust. The Grand Master was dead. The vast network in Persia was extinguished. Yet, in Syria, the assassin statelet, under its own line of leaders, still breathed. Their leader was a man of quiet determination, a shadow of the legendary Sinan. He knew Masyaf could not withstand the Mongol tide. Hulagu's army, flush with victory, was now turning its attention to the remnants of the Abbasid Caliphate and the Ayyubid principalities of Syria. The assassins of Masyaf were a secondary target, but a target nonetheless. Survival now depended not on defiance, but on a humiliating, desperate pragmatism. An embassy was sent to the Mongol camp. The assassin envoys, once the terror of kings, now stood as supplicants before the stern, alien faces of the Mongol commanders. They did not offer threats or displays of power. They offered submission. They pledged loyalty to the great Khan monk, promising to become his vassals, to provide intelligence, to open their fortresses to his troops. It was a complete and utter capitulation. Hulagu Khan, focused on the greater prize of Baghdad, accepted their surrender. Masyaf was spared the torch. For a few years, the Syrian assassins existed as a pathetic puppet state, a ghost of its former self, paying tribute and obeying the commands of their Mongol overlords. The fighting no longer struck at the hearts of empires. They served as scouts and guides for the very force that had annihilated their Persian brethren. But the world was shifting again. A new power was rising in Egypt, the Mamluk Sultanate. These were slave soldiers who had seized power, and they were the first military force to consistently defeat the Mongols in open battle. In 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut, the Mamluks shattered the myth of Mongol invincibility. The balance of power in the Levant swung violently. The assassins at Masyaf, ever the survivors, saw a new opportunity. They switched their allegiance, offering their services to the Mamluk Sultan, Baybars. But Baybars was a man of a new age. He had no patience for a semi-independent, heretical state within his domains. He saw the assassins not as allies, but as a relic, a dangerous anachronism. In 1270, Baybars moved against Masyaf. He did not come with a vast besieging army. He came with an ultimatum. The terms were final: the unconditional surrender of all assassin fortresses in Syria. There would be no negotiation, no tribute, no autonomy. The order was to disband. Its members were to be absorbed, their castles taken over by Mamluk garrisons. The last Grand Master of Masyaf stood on his walls, looking down at the Mamluk forces. He knew the game was over. The age of the independent assassin state was finished. There were no more empires to play against each other, no more shadows in which to hide. To resist was to share the fate of Alamut. With a heavy heart, he gave the order. The gates of Masyaf were opened. The Mamluk soldiers marched in. There was no final battle, no glorious last stand. The fighting laid down their arms. The citadel that had defied Saladin and terrified the Crusaders was occupied without a fight. The assassins were disbanded, their members scattered, their name fading from politics into legend. The last echo of the order had died not with a dagger's flash, but with the quiet, final click of a gate closing, the sound of an era slipping into the silent past. The phoenix's ashes. The fall of Masyaf in 1270 was not the absolute end of the Nizari-Ismaili line. Like a plant whose main stem has been cut, the community did not die, but went to ground, its life force retreating into hidden roots. The Imams, the spiritual descendants of Hassanai, Sabbah's hidden lord, went into deep concealment. For generations, they lived in the shadows of Persian towns, their identities a closely guarded secret known only to a dwindling number of faithful. They were no longer princes of a mountain state, but hunted men, their legacy a dangerous secret. The world moved on. The Mongols converted to Islam and were absorbed. The Mamluks gave way to the Ottomans. The Crusades became a memory. The name assassin persisted in European folklore, a byword for a mysterious, treacherous killer. But the living reality of the order was a fading whisper. Then, in the 18th century, a remarkable transformation began. The Imams emerged from hiding, not as warlords, but as peaceful leaders. They settled in the village of Kahak, and later, the Qajar Shah of Persia granted them the fortress of Mahalat. The shift was profound. The ethos of the community, once defined by the political jihad of the dagger, was consciously and deliberately reoriented towards a spiritual jihad al-Akbar, the greater struggle against the self. The man who would complete this transformation and ensure the community's survival into the modern era was the 46th Imam, Hassan Ali Shah. In the early 19th century, he was granted the honorific title of Aga Khan, Master Lord by the Qajar monarch. Aga Khan, I was a man of both spiritual authority and worldly acumen. He navigated the treacherous politics of 19th century Persia. But when a conflict with the Qajar court forced him to flee, he made a momentous decision. He led a mass migration of his followers east, out of Persia, to the relative stability of British India. This exodus was the final, definitive break with the past. The community, now known as the Khoja Ismailis, settled in Sindh and Gujarat. The Aga Khan encouraged them to become loyal citizens of their new homelands, to engage in commerce and education. The Faidain were replaced by merchants and scholars. The fortress was replaced by the Jamat Khana, place of congregation. The dagger was replaced by the ledger and the textbook. Under the successive Aga Khans, this evolution accelerated. Aga Khan III, Sir Sultan Muhammad Shah, became a global statesman, representing India at the League of Nations and championing modern education and the advancement of women. He systematically dismantled the remnants of the old, insular community structure, urging integration and contribution to the wider societies in which his followers lived. The ultimate symbol of this rebirth is the present Imam, Shah Karim al-Husseini, Aga Khan IV. A Harvard-educated visionary, his life's work has been the Aga Khan Development Network, AKDN, one of the largest private development agencies in the world. The AKDN does not build fortresses. It builds universities, hospitals, and hydroelectric dams. It does not train assassins. It trains teachers, doctors, and engineers. Its mission is not to instill fear, but to alleviate poverty, promote pluralism, and foster cultural understanding. From the ashes of Alamut, a global community of several million has risen, defined not by the terror it inspires, but by the hope it provides. The phoenix that emerged from the fire of the Mongol cataclysm was not a bird of prey, but a dove. The legacy of the assassins is no longer one of political murder, but one of resilient faith, intellectual pursuit, and a profound commitment to improving the human condition. A transformation as dramatic and complete as any in the history of the world. Today, the ruins of Alamut stand silent under the same vast, indifferent sky. The wind sighs through the broken arches, a ghost of the intellectual and spiritual tempest that once raged within. Tourists and archaeologists scramble over the tumbled stones, trying to grasp the magnitude of what happened here. The name assassin endures, immortalized in a dozen languages, a synonym for a cold, political killer. But this is the shadow, the distorted memory. The substance, the living reality, is elsewhere. It is in the gleaming research labs of the Aga Khan University in Karachi. It is in the restored gardens of the Al-Azhar Park in Cairo, a gift of green space to a bustling city. It is in the rural clinics in Bangladesh and the banks providing microcredit to women in East Africa. The story of the assassins is, therefore, a tale of two legacies. One is the legend, a dark romance of fanatical killers and a mysterious old man in his mountain fortress, a story that will forever captivate the human imagination with its themes of power, faith, and death. The other is the living community, a testament to the incredible capacity for human reinvention. It is the story of how a people, hounded to the brink of extinction, chose to transform their defining principle from physical violence to spiritual and intellectual enlightenment, from taking life to enriching it. The true, final lesson of the assassins is not that a small, determined group can defy empires. It is that even the most hardened identity can be softened, that the most militant faith can find expression in peace, and that the most powerful weapon of all is not the dagger that ends a life, but the enduring will to build a better one. The shadow of the dagger has long since faded. The substance of the spirit endures. The architect of fear. To understand the assassins is to understand the mind of Hassan-i Sabbah. He was not a warrior king, but a master architect, an architect of faith, of an organization, and most profoundly, of fear. His genius lay in his understanding of a fundamental truth. In a world of vast armies and sprawling empires, the most efficient form of power was not the control of territory, but the control of perception. His first architectural project was physical, the fortress of Alamut itself. But his true masterpiece was the system he built within its walls. He designed a self-sustaining entity, a state in miniature that could outlast any siege. The granaries, the cisterns, the library, each was a component in a machine designed for perpetual endurance. This physical resilience was the foundation upon which the psychological edifice was built. An enemy must know that the fortress could not be starved, could not be taken by storm. This knowledge was the first seed of doubt. His second design was the Fidean. He did not merely train killers. He engineered a new type of human instrument. The training was a process of total deconstruction and reconstruction. The young recruit's former identity was stripped away. His tribal loyalties, his family ties, his personal ambitions. In their place, Hassan installed a new, overriding purpose, absolute obedience to the Imam and his dai. The initiation in the Paradise Garden was the final, masterful stroke. It bypassed the intellect and spoke directly to the senses, creating a neurological imprint of paradise that was more real than the mortal world. The Fidean was not a fanatic in the sense of a wild-eyed berserker. He was a calm, focused, and utterly resolved instrument. His willingness to die was not a despairing act, but a logical step towards a guaranteed, sensual eternity. This created an agent that was psychologically invulnerable, a weapon that could not be deterred by the threat of pain or death. His third and most brilliant design was the strategic use of this instrument. Hassan-i Sabbah was a pioneer of asymmetric warfare. He recognized that he could never defeat the Seljuk Empire in a pitched battle. So, he changed the battlefield. He moved the conflict from the open plains to the shadowy corridors of power, from the clash of armies to the intimate space between a ruler and his subject. The dagger was the perfect symbol of this shift. It was personal, quiet, and undeniable. Every assassination was a meticulously crafted piece of political communication. The target was always high value, a vizier, a general, a sultan. The method was always public, demonstrating that the victim's guards, wealth, and power were meaningless. The Fidaeans' willingness to be captured or killed immediately after the act was the final, chilling part of the message. It proclaimed that the order had an infinite supply of such men, that the death of one was irrelevant to the cause. Hassan thus constructed a feedback loop of terror. A single, high-profile killing would cause a ruler to become paranoid, retreating behind his walls, distrusting his own court. This paralysis would often force him to withdraw military pressure from the assassin strongholds. This success would, in turn, reinforce the myth of the order's invincibility, attracting more recruits and increasing its power. He turned fear into a strategic resource, a currency more valuable than gold or soldiers. He was the architect who built not with stone, but with human belief and political perception. He constructed a fortress in the mind of his enemies so formidable that they would defeat themselves with their own dread long before their armies ever reached his walls. The physical Alamut was merely the workshop. The true fortress was the one he built in the imagination of the world, a fortress that would stand long after its stones had crumbled. The web of spies, before a dagger ever flashed in the sun, long before a Fidoan made his fatal approach, the ground was prepared by an invisible army. This was the Dawa, the network of summoners and spies that formed the true nervous system of the assassin state. If the Fidaean were the order's clenched fist, the Dawa were its 1,000 unseen eyes and ears, a web of intelligence that stretched from the palaces of Isfahan to the souks of Damascus. Recruitment into this shadow corps was a more subtle art than the forging of a warrior. Agents were not chosen for physical prowess, but for intellect, discretion, and a chameleon's ability to blend in. They were the merchants who dealt in silks and spices, their caravans crossing borders freely, their wagons sometimes hiding messengers or coded letters. They were the physicians attending to the ailments of the rich and powerful, privy to secrets whispered in feverish confidence. They were the minor officials and scribes in royal courts, their humble positions granting them access to sensitive documents and unguarded conversations. The training of a Dai, or summoner, was a lifelong study in human psychology and tradecraft. They learned to read the subtle hierarchies of a royal court in the slight incline of a head or the choice of a seat. They mastered the art of the seemingly casual question, the offhand remark that could elicit a torrent of unguarded information. They developed a network of informants, disgruntled servants, indebted guards, spurned courtiers, who could be bought with coin, ideology, or the promise of power. In the city of Nishapur, a key Seljuk administrative center, a Dai known to us only as the bookseller operated a thriving scriptorium. His shop was a haven for scholars, a place of quiet industry where manuscripts were copied and illuminated. The bookseller was a respected figure, known for his fair prices and vast knowledge. He listened to the gossip of the university, the complaints of junior bureaucrats, the boasts of military officers. He never wrote anything down. He committed it all to a memory trained to perfection. At night, the information was encoded into seemingly innocent mercantile letters and sent via trusted caravan drivers towards the mountains. The intelligence that flowed back to Alamut was meticulously cataloged and analyzed by Hassanai Sabah and his inner circle. They built detailed dossiers on every significant political figure in the region. They knew of Sultan Sanjar's fondness for a particular breed of falcon, of the vizier's secret sympathy for Mutazilite philosophy, of the simmering rivalry between two Seljuk generals. This knowledge was not merely academic, it was operational. When the order was given to eliminate a target, the Dawa provided the Faidain with everything he needed. He was not sent in blind. He knew his victim's schedule, his route to the mosque, the composition of his bodyguard, the layout of his palace. He knew which guards could be bribed, which servant could be persuaded to leave a gate unlocked, which of the victim's companions was vain and could be flattered into providing an introduction. The most successful assassinations were those that seemed to erupt from nowhere, but in reality, they were the culmination of months, sometimes years, of patient intelligence work. The Dawa identified the target's single point of failure, the moment of piety, the habit of accessibility, the trusted confidant, and the Faidan was simply the final, sharp instrument that exploited it. This web of spies made the assassins seem omniscient. A prince would receive a warning letter, detailing a private conversation he had held in his own garden, a conversation he believed to be utterly secret. The effect was paralyzing. It created an atmosphere of pervasive suspicion, where no one could be trusted, and the walls themselves seemed to have ears. The dagger was the exclamation point, but the Dawa wrote the sentence. They were the unseen architects of the terror that allowed a handful of men in a mountain fortress to command the attention of emperors and kings, proving that information, in the hands of a master, was a weapon more precise and far-reaching than any sword. The fractured mirror. The death of Hassanai Sabah did not just create a power vacuum. It revealed a fundamental tension that had been growing within the order. It was the tension between the Persian heartland of Alamut and the Syrian branch at Masyaf. Under Hassan's absolute, centralized authority, this tension was managed. But with his passing, the two wings of the assassin state began to drift apart, like continents slowly separating, their cultures and strategies evolving in response to their unique environments. The unified shadow cast by Alamut now fractured into two distinct silhouettes. In Persia, the succession of Bujurgumid and his son Muhammad ushered in an era of consolidation. The Persian branch became more institutionalized, more bureaucratic. Its focus remained on its existential struggle with the various Turkish and Mongol powers of the Iranian plateau. Its methods were those of its founder, disciplined, strategic, and deeply enmeshed in the complex politics of the Persian court. The Persian assassin was a political operator, a master of the long game, using assassination as a precise tool of statecraft to maintain a delicate balance of power against much larger neighbors. In Syria, under the legendary Rashid ad-Din Sinan, the order evolved differently. Syria was a kaleidoscope of competing powers, Crusader states, Turkish Atabegs, the rising star of Saladin, and then the Mamluks. Survival here required a different kind of genius, not just political, but theatrical. Sinan, isolated by the collapse of the Persian mother house and facing immediate, multiple threats, cultivated an aura of personal divinity. He was not just the Dai. He was the Sheikh al-Jabal, a miracle worker whose authority was mystical and absolute. This divergence was reflected in their very operational methods. The Persian Faidoin, trained in the rigid scholasticism of Alamut, were often scholars and theologians, their disguises rooted in the intellectual and religious classes of Persian society. The Syrian Faidoin, operating in the religiously charged environment of the Crusader Levant, became masters of a different kind of deception. They famously disguised themselves as Christian monks or ascetics, immersing themselves so completely in their roles that they could attend Mass and recite psalms, their piety a perfect mask for their deadly purpose. The schism was more than just geographical or methodological. It was almost theological. The Syrian branch, under Sinan, developed a more pronounced emphasis on the batin, the esoteric, hidden meaning of the faith. Sinan's alleged miracles, his direct connection to the divine, were a source of his power. In Persia, the leadership remained more anchored in the political and legalistic doctrines established by Hassan, where obedience to the imam's representative was the paramount virtue, less dependent on displays of supernatural power. This fracture had profound strategic consequences. They were no longer a single, coordinated entity. A decision made in Alamut did not necessarily bind the masters of Masyaf. They sometimes worked at cross purposes. While the Persian branch was focused on surviving the Mongol storm, the Syrian branch was negotiating its own survival with the Mamluks and terrifying the Franks. They were two separate states, sharing a name and a method, but not always a common goal. The fractured mirror ultimately weakened the order. It could no longer present a unified front to the world. When the Mongols extinguished the Persian branch, the Syrian branch was left isolated, a detached limb that could only survive by submitting to a new master. The unity of purpose that had been Hassanai Sabah's greatest achievement was gone, and in its place were two reflections of the original ideal, each brilliant in its own way, but each unable to withstand the coming tempest alone. The shadow had split, and in splitting it had diminished. The library of lost light. Within the heart of Alamut, behind doors of aged cedar, guarded by men who were scholars first and warriors second, lay the true treasure of the assassin state, its library. It was a place of profound silence, broken only by the soft rustle of vellum and the whisper of a turning page. The air was thick with the scent of cedar oil, used to preserve the leather bindings, and the dry, sweet smell of ancient paper. This was not merely a collection of books. It was the mind of the order, a repository of knowledge more carefully guarded and more vital than any store of gold or weapons. Hassanai Sabah, the scholar revolutionary, had begun its collection. His agents, armed with letters of credit instead of daggers, scoured the known world. They sought out not just Ismaili texts, but the sum of human understanding. From the great house of wisdom in Baghdad, they acquired works of Greek philosophy, Aristotle's logic, Plato's republics, the geometry of Euclid. From the observatories of Moraga, they brought star charts and astronomical tables. From India, they brought treatises on mathematics and medicine. From the Fatimid libraries of Cairo, they gathered esoteric Ismaili interpretations of the Quran and mystical Sufi poetry. The library was organized with a terrifying efficiency that mirrored the order itself. Scribes, many of them Faidian in training, spent their days not in physical exercise, but in the meticulous work of preservation. They copied crumbling texts onto fresh parchment, their hands moving with the same disciplined precision they would later apply to the handling of a dagger. Illuminators added intricate geometric designs in the margins, their art a reflection of the order's belief in the hidden mathematical order of the universe. This was the second education of the assassin. A Faidian was expected to be more than a blind fanatic. He was to be an intellectual warrior, capable of debating a Sunni alim on the finer points of theology or discussing Aristotelian logic with a Christian philosopher. He needed to understand the mind of his enemy, to know his culture, his beliefs, his weaknesses. The library provided the tools for this. A Faidian sent to infiltrate the court of the Seljuk Sultan would have studied the history of the Seljuk dynasty, the complex rivalries of its courtiers, and the poetic forms popular among the aristocracy. The library was also the engine of the order's ideological unity. Here, Hassan and his successors composed the doctrinal texts that defined Nizari Ismailism. They wrote polemics against their Sunni and Crusader enemies, and philosophical tracts exploring the nature of the Imam and the concept of Talim. This was where the intellectual battles were fought and won, where the heterodox ideas of the order were codified and defended. It was a fortress of the mind, as impregnable in its way as the stone walls surrounding it. When a Mongol storm finally broke upon Alamut, the destruction of this library was a primary objective for Hulagu Khan. To the Mongols, it was a nest of heresy. To the modern mind, it was an act of catastrophic cultural vandalism. The chroniclers wrote of the smoke from the burning manuscripts darkening the sky for days. The accumulated knowledge of centuries, the unique fusion of Greek rationalism, Persian mysticism, and Ismaili theology was fed to the flames. The pages of Aristotle were consumed alongside the secret histories of the order. The light of a unique intellectual tradition was extinguished, its ashes scattered by the same mountain wind that had once carried the whispers of its scholars. The loss of the Library of Alamut is one of the great tragedies of intellectual history. It was the death of a world, the silencing of a unique and formidable voice in the dialogue of human civilization. The daggers of the Faidarin could be broken, and the walls of their fortresses thrown down, but in the burning of their books, something far more precious was lost forever, a way of thinking, a school of philosophy, a library of lost light. The Final Testament. The last days of the assassin state in Persia were not marked by a climactic battle, but by a slow, chilling unraveling. The Mongol noose, woven from countless horsemen and an alien determination, tightened with methodical, impersonal force. The great fortresses, whose names had once struck terror into hearts from Europe to China, Alamut, Lamsar, Mehmundiz, were now isolated islands in a rising metallic sea. The young Imam, Rukn al-Din Kersha, sat in the chamber of his predecessors in Alamut. The air, once vibrant with the scent of ink and the hum of intellectual energy, now felt stale and heavy with dread. He was a man caught in a historical trap, inheriting a legacy of absolute defiance, just as an enemy arrived against whom defiance was suicide. The sophisticated system of psychological warfare, the web of spies, the dedicated fighting, all were useless against the Mongol imperative of total annihilation. His first desperate act was one of negotiation. He sent emissaries to Hulagu's camp, offering the submission of the Ismaili state. He hoped to save his people, to transform the order from a sovereign entity into a vassal, to preserve some shard of their existence. Hulagu, a master of a different kind of strategy, saw this not as a peace offering, but as a sign of terminal weakness. He played a cruel game. He demanded the surrender of all fortresses as a precondition for talks. One by one, trusting their imam's diplomacy, the proud citadels of the assassins opened their gates. And one by one, they were occupied by Mongol troops, their garrisons disarmed, their independence extinguished. Rukn al-Din was then used as a tool, a puppet king force to order the surrender of the few remaining holdouts. He was paraded before the walls of Lamsar, his voice, the voice of the Imam, commanding his own followers to lay down their arms. It was the ultimate humiliation, a systematic dismantling of the very principle of authority upon which the order was built. The Faidain, trained to die for their Imam, now watched him collaborate with the destroyer of their world. The psychological blow was more devastating than any Mongol siege engine. When his usefulness was exhausted, the charade ended. Rukn al-Din was taken from Alamut by his Mongol hosts. The journey was a death march. Somewhere on the road to the Mongol capital, he was set upon by his guards and brutally killed, his body discarded. The message was clear. The Mongols did not just want to conquer, they wanted to erase. The line of imams that had guided the order for nearly 2 centuries was to be extinguished. The final act was the desecration. Mongol soldiers, under the direction of Chinese engineers, systematically slighted Alamut. They did not just capture it, they unmade it. The mighty walls were pulled down, stone by stone. The legendary granaries were breached and their contents scattered. The hidden pipes of the Paradise Garden were shattered, and the library, the mind of the order, was put to the torch. The priceless manuscripts, the works of philosophy, the secret histories, the doctrinal texts, all fed a pyre whose smoke was the funeral shroud of a unique civilization. The few survivors, those who had escaped the fortresses before they fell, or who had been away on missions, scattered to the winds. The great network was broken. The Dawa went silent. The Faidain had no one to command them. The final testament of the assassin state was not written on parchment, but in the silent, broken stones of Alamut and in the scattered, hunted lives of its people. It was a testament to the brutal truth that no matter how brilliant, how disciplined, or how feared an organization may be, it cannot forever withstand the overwhelming, impersonal force of a world empire determined to consign it to history. The age of the assassin was over. The long, slow winter of their diaspora had begun. The Phoenix in exile. The fall of Alamut was not an end, but a violent scattering. Like seeds from a scorched plant, the surviving Nizari Ismailis were blown across the landscape of a hostile world. The once proud citizens of a feared state became fugitives, heretics hiding their faith, their imams living in secrecy, their very identity a dangerous secret. For centuries, they were a people of the shadows, their continuity hanging by the fragile thread of a hidden spiritual lineage. This period, known as the Satri, concealment, was a trial by fire that forged a new kind of resilience. The community survived not through the power of the dagger, but through the quiet tenacity of faith and a genius for assimilation. They appeared as ordinary Muslims, often Sufis, in the towns and villages of Persia. Their imams, from Hassan II to the 40th Imam, Shahnazar, lived in precarious anonymity, guiding their followers through a network of trusted deputies, their lives constantly under threat. The first flicker of the phoenix, rising, came in the 18th century with the emergence of the imams in the village of Kahak. No longer merely hiding, they began to consolidate their scattered followers. This fragile resurgence was given a monumental boost in 1817 when the 46th Imam, Hassan Ali Shah, was born. A man of charisma, diplomatic skill, and immense spiritual authority, he was granted the honorific title of Aga Khan, Master Lord, by the Qajar monarch, Fath Ali Shah. This formal recognition was a lifeline, the first official sanction the community had received in over 500 years. Yet, the old persecutions resurfaced. Entangled in the complex and treacherous politics of the Qajar court, Aga Khan, I was forced to lead his followers in a dramatic exodus. This was the pivotal moment. The conscious turn away from a past defined by mountain fortresses and towards a future built on mobility and integration. He led his people east, out of Persia, to the relative stability of British India. The arrival in Sindh and Gujarat was a rebirth. The Aga Khan encouraged his followers, now known as Khoja Ismailis, to embrace their new homelands. He urged them to become pillars of their communities through commerce, education, and civic responsibility. The martial discipline of the Faidian was redirected into commercial enterprise. The intellectual rigor once devoted to theology and strategy was now applied to law, medicine, and engineering. The community structure was reformed, shifting from a secretive state within a state to a transparent, modern religious community with a clear hierarchy and a global outlook. Under the leadership of Aga Khan III, Sir Sultan Muhammad Shah, this transformation accelerated into a global vision. He was a statesman on the world stage, a delegate to the League of Nations, and a fierce advocate for Indian independence and modern education. He explicitly reinterpreted the old concept of jihad, declaring that the greatest struggle was now against ignorance, poverty, and prejudice. He empowered women, declaring that the seclusion of women was not an Islamic imperative and championing female education. This philosophical evolution finds its ultimate expression in the work of the present Imam, Shah Karim al-Husseini, Aga Khan IV. His life's work is the Aga Khan Development Network, AKDN, one of the world's largest private development agencies. The AKDN is the antithesis of the old assassin state. It does not command fortresses but builds universities like the Aga Khan University in Karachi and the University of Central Asia. It does not train assassins but deploys doctors, teachers, and agricultural specialists. Its mission is not to instill fear, but to foster hope, promoting pluralism, alleviating poverty, and revitalizing cultural heritage from Cairo to Kabul. The phoenix that rose from the ashes of Alamut and Masyaf is a global community of millions, defined by peace, professionalism, and philanthropy. The shadow of the dagger has been replaced by the substance of service. The legacy of the assassins is no longer one of political terror, but a powerful narrative of survival, adaptation, and the profound redemption of a faith that chose to build a better world, rather than simply terrorize the old one. The two-edged sword. The legend of the assassins, meticulously crafted by Hassan I Sabah, was a weapon with two edges. One edge was honed to a razor's sharpness, a tool of psychological domination that cowed empires. The other was a blunt, unpredictable instrument that would eventually recoil upon its creators, shaping a legacy of demonization that would last for centuries. The Order's fearsome reputation, its greatest strategic asset, also became its inescapable prison. From a moment the first dagger found its mark in the heart of Nizam al-Mulk, the assassins began to lose control of their own narrative. To their Sunni rivals, they were not political strategists, but Malahida, heretics of the most dangerous kind, whose deviation from Orthodox Islam justified any persecution. Their theological sophistication was seen not as intellectualism, but as devilish cunning, a web of lies designed to lead the faithful astray. It was in the West, however, that the legend was most profoundly and permanently distorted. The Crusaders, encountering Sinan's Syrian branch, were both terrified and fascinated. They lacked the cultural and theological context to understand Ismaili Shurism. Instead, they grasped for familiar concepts to explain the Faidaeans' inexplicable courage and obedience. The result was a grotesque and enduring caricature. Chroniclers like William of Tyre and Arnold of Lubeck wove a tapestry of sensational fiction. They popularized the story, almost certainly apocryphal, that the name assassin came from Hashishiyin, claiming the Faidian were drugged with hashish to give them a foretaste of paradise and the courage to kill. This narrative reduced the complex theological and psychological conditioning of the Faidian to a cheap trick a chemical-induced frenzy. It stripped them of their agency and their faith, turning them into mindless puppets. The figure of the old man of the mountain was transformed in European lore from a severe scholar-statesman into a demonic sorcerer king. Marco Polo, who never visited Alamut but collected tales along the Silk Road, cemented this image in the European imagination. He described a magician who built a secret valley of sensual pleasures, drugging his young followers and convincing them they were in paradise, all to turn them into unwitting tools of murder. This version was far more compelling to a medieval European audience than the reality of a disciplined religious order, and it stuck. This manufactured legend had dire consequences. It made genuine diplomacy with Western powers nearly impossible. How does one negotiate with a myth? It provided a perfect pretext for their enemies to justify their extermination. To the Mongols, they were not just a political rival, but a nest of sorcerers and deceivers. The destruction of their libraries and the hunting of their imams was framed not just as a conquest, but as a righteous purge. Long after the order's political power was crushed, the legend lived on, seeping into literature, opera, and eventually film. The word assassin entered the global lexicon, forever associating the Nizari Ismailis with their darkest caricature. For the surviving community, this has been a heavy burden to bear, a history written by their enemies, identity conflated with senseless murder. The final, bitter irony is that the very weapon Hassanai Sabbah forged, the weapon of terror, ultimately proved to be a two-edged sword. It granted him power in life, but in death, it stole his legacy, transforming a complex chapter of Islamic history into a simplistic and monstrous fairy tale. The assassins mastered the art of controlling perception in their own time, but they ultimately lost the war for their memory, becoming prisoners of a legend they themselves had set in motion, but could never control. The Code of the Shadows. Within the formidable walls of Alamut and Masyaf, beneath the surface of terror they projected to the outside world, thrived a society governed by a code of conduct as rigid and intricate as the geometric patterns adorning their manuscripts. This was not the lawless den of brigands their enemies portrayed, but a disciplined theocracy, a state whose internal machinery was fueled by a unique blend of spiritual fervor, intellectual pursuit, and merciless pragmatism. The life of an assassin, from the lowliest initiate to the Dai himself, was one of absolute structure. At the apex stood the Dai al-Kerbal, the Grandmaster. His authority was total, derived from his position as the representative of the hidden Imam. Yet, this was not the decadent court of a typical medieval ruler. Hassanai Sabbah had set the precedent, a life of extreme personal austerity. He was said to have left his chamber only twice in 35 years. His meals were simple, his dress plain, his personal life a mystery. This self-denial was a powerful tool of leadership. It proved that his motives were purely for the cause, insulating him from accusations of personal ambition and setting an uncompromising standard for all who followed. The social structure was a pyramid of initiated knowledge. The vast majority of the fortress's inhabitants were the Lazic, the common people, farmers, herders, artisans, and soldiers who formed the economic backbone of the state. They lived pious lives, following the exoteric *Zahir* commands of Ismaili law, providing the food and material that made the fortresses self-sufficient. They believed in the Imam and his Dai, but they were not privy to the inner doctrines. Above them were the ranks of the initiated, the fuqaha, jurists, and the hujjah, proofs, who formed the religious and administrative bureaucracy. They were the scholars, the judges, the teachers, and the diplomats. They understood the esoteric interpretations of the faith and managed the daily affairs of the state. And then there were the Fidoin. They were not a separate class, but a role, a sacred duty to which the most promising young men from any level could be called. Their training was the most intense and secretive of all. They lived in separate barracks, their lives a relentless cycle of physical conditioning, weapons mastery, and intellectual study. They were taught to endure pain, hunger, and exhaustion without complaint. Their discipline was absolute. A story is told of Hassanai Sabah ordering a Fidoin to leap from the high walls of Alamut to prove his obedience. The young man, without hesitation, began to run towards the edge, only to be stopped at the last moment. The lesson was about the totality of submission. This internal code was enforced with a terrifying consistency. Justice was swift and severe. The execution of Hassan's own sons for alleged crimes was the ultimate demonstration that no one was above the law of the order. Transgressions, theft, betrayal, drunkenness, heresy were met with immediate and often capital punishment. This internal ruthlessness was the glue that held the society together. It created a climate of absolute trust among the members. A man's word was his bond, for the consequence of deceit was death. This rigid internal structure was the true source of the assassin's strength. The outside world saw only the public acts of terror, the shocking, theatrical murders. They did not see the silent, disciplined, and highly organized society that made those acts possible. The Code of the Shadows ensured that every member, from the farmer tilling a terrace on the mountainside to the fight-in poised to strike in a distant city, was a single, cohesive component in a machine dedicated to a single purpose: the survival and supremacy of the order. It was a society that asked for everything from its members, and in return, offered them a place in what they believed was a divine, cosmic struggle. The Garden of the Unseen. The journey of a fight-in began not with a weapon, but with a question. A promising youth, marked by his intelligence and piety, would be summoned from his studies or his duties. He would be led to a chamber deep within the fortress, a room devoid of ornament, where Senior Dai would sit in silence. The only light came from a single, high window, illuminating the Dai's face, leaving the youth in shadow. "Are you prepared to see with more than your eyes?" the Dai would ask, his voice low and resonant. "Are you ready to know the truth that lies behind the veil of this world?" This was the beginning of the Talim, the esoteric instruction that would transform a devout young man into a weapon of the unseen. The training was a gradual unveiling, a systematic deconstruction of reality as he knew it. He was taught that the physical world was a mere shadow, a complex allegory for a higher, spiritual reality, the Batin. The Quran's commandments, the rituals of prayer, were not ends in themselves, but symbolic gateways to a deeper understanding, accessible only through the guidance of the infallible Imam and his representative, the Dai. The initiate learned that history was not a random sequence of events, but a cyclical drama of divine revelation and initiation. He was taught that he was part of a cosmic vanguard, the few who could perceive the true light in an age of spiritual darkness. His enemies, the Sunni caliphs, the Crusader kings, were not just political opponents. They were active forces of ignorance, taghut, idols, whose removal was a metaphysical necessity, a sacred duty that purified the world. The culmination of this intellectual and spiritual conditioning was the garden. After years of preparation, the chosen fight-in was given a sweet, heavily drugged potion. He would slip into a profound, dreamless sleep and awaken in the Jannat al-Bustan, the paradise Hassanah Sabah had engineered on a hidden terrace of Alamut. The experience was a full sensory epiphany. The air was warm and heavy with the perfume of jasmine and rose. The sound of trickling water from hidden channels was a constant music. He saw lush greenery, trees heavy with figs and pomegranates, and pavilions of silk. And there were the attendants, young men and women of ethereal beauty, who spoke to him in soft, melodic voices, offering him succulent fruits and sweet wine. "You have been faithful," they would whisper. "This is the reward for your service. This is the truth behind the promises. This is your home." For a day and a night, he would live in this sensory paradise, every desire anticipated and fulfilled. It was not a vague promise of heaven. It was a tangible, visceral reality. Then, the potion would be administered once more. He would awake, groggy and disoriented, back in his sparse cell in the fortress barracks. The Sinudai would be waiting. "You have tasted the truth of the next world," he would say, his hand on the young man's shoulder. "The Master has shown you the reality that awaits the faithful. This life is a fleeting test. That garden is your eternal home. Through your obedience, through the ultimate sacrifice, you can return there forever." The psychological impact was irreversible. The memory of the garden was not a dream. It was a more real and vibrant memory than any from his mortal life. The austere world of Alamut, the fear of death, the hardship of training, all of it was now a temporary illusion, a brief prelude to an everlasting, sensual bliss. The Fightin was now a citizen of the next world, merely sojourning in this one. His was no longer his own. He was a perfect instrument, free from the fear of death because he knew, with a certainty beyond faith, what lay beyond it. He had been to the garden of the unseen, and he would do anything to return. The last gaze from the mountain, the wind that now whispers through the broken teeth of Alamut's ramparts carries no secrets of state, no whispered prayers of the Fightin. It is only wind, scouring stone that has been dead for centuries. The silence here is absolute, a physical presence heavier than the mountain itself. To stand amidst these ruins is to stand at the edge of living memory, where history bleeds into myth, and the echoes of a world-shaking drama have faded into a tourist guide's recitation. The legacy of the assassins is a palimpsest, a parchment written over many times. The topmost layer, the one most visible to the world, is the legend, the word assassin itself, a synonym for a treacherous, politically motivated killer. It is a romanticized villain of video games and fantasy novels, the shadowy figure in the crowd, the wielder of the poison blade. This is the story the assassin's enemies told, and it is the story that stuck. Beneath that lies the historical reality, a fascinating, complex chapter in Islamic history. The Nizari Ismaili state was a revolutionary entity, a theocracy that defied the feudal and imperial orders of its day. It was a state built on a fusion of high-minded intellectualism and ruthless realpolitik, a place where philosophy and the dagger were two sides of the same coin. For nearly 2 centuries, they perfected a form of asymmetric warfare that allowed them to punch far above their weight, holding sultans and kings hostage to their own fear. But the deepest layer, the one that truly endures, is not in the ruined fortresses, but in the living community that survived their destruction. The phoenix that rose from the ashes of Alamut and Masyaf did not seek to rebuild a state of fear. It chose a different path. The modern Nizari Ismaili community, under the guidance of the Aga Khans, represents one of the most remarkable transformations in human history. They have transmuted the legacy of the dagger into a legacy of the plowshare and the book. The absolute obedience once given to the old man of the mountain is now channeled into a disciplined, global effort to improve the human condition. The intellectual rigor that was once devoted to theological strategy and political subversion now fuels a network of universities, hospitals, and development agencies. The ethos of self-sacrifice that drove the fight to martyrdom now inspires doctors to serve in remote clinics and engineers to build bridges in impoverished regions. The last gaze from the mountain, therefore, is not a look backwards in longing, but a look forward in hope. The stones of Alamut are a monument to a past that is rightly gone, a past of sectarian violence and political murder. But the spirit that was forged in those mountains, a spirit of resilience, intellectual curiosity, and unwavering loyalty to a guiding principle, did not die. It was refined, purified, and redirected. The true end of the assassin story is not their downfall in the 13th century, but their redemption in the 21st. It is the story of a community that stared into the abyss of extinction and chose, against all odds, to turn away from the shadow of the dagger and walk into the light of service. The mountain fortress is a ghost, but the people and the transformed spirit they carry forward are vibrantly, powerfully alive. The final lesson of the assassins is not about how to wield power, but about how to transcend it. Not about how to die for a cause, but about how to build a life that makes that cause worthy of the sacrifice. The shadow and the substance. The Chronicle of the Assassins, from the austere genius of Hassan I. Sabbah to the global philanthropy of the Aga Khan Development Network, represents one of history's most profound narratives of transformation. It is a story that holds a double image, a lesson in the duality of power and the enduring potential for human reinvention. For nearly 2 centuries, the order demonstrated that the most formidable power is often not military might, but psychological dominance. They proved that a carefully cultivated aura of invincibility, backed by the terrifying reality of unwavering commitment, could humble empires. Their legacy is a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, a chillingly effective blueprint for how a small, disciplined group can leverage fear as a strategic currency. The shadow they cast was long, dark, and for a time, it dictated the actions of kings and sultans. This is the legacy of the fight-in, of the dagger in the sunlight, of the old man in his mountain fortress. A legacy of formidable, focused, and fearsome power. Yet, this very strength contained the seeds of its own limitation. The reliance on terror ultimately bred an equally powerful and unifying fear of them, leading to their eventual annihilation by an enemy that could not be intimidated or reached by the dagger. Their story serves as a timeless warning that power rooted primarily in fear is inherently brittle. It can command obedience, but it cannot foster genuine loyalty. It can coerce action, but it cannot inspire lasting growth. It is a fortress that, once besieged by an overwhelming and indifferent force, reveals its ultimate fragility. The greater, more enduring legacy, however, lies not in the methods of the past, but in the choices of the present. The phoenix that rose from the ashes of Alamut did not seek to reclaim its old form. In a conscious and deliberate act of spiritual and intellectual evolution, the community chose to redirect its core strengths, discipline, unity, and a sense of divine purpose, away from destruction and toward creation. The unwavering obedience once given to a military commander is now given to the cause of human dignity. The intellectual rigor once devoted to political strategy is now channeled into scientific research and economic development. The global network that once existed to gather intelligence now exists to disseminate aid and knowledge. The substance of the assassin's spirit, therefore, has triumphed over its shadow. The name that once evoked a shudder of fear now inspires respect for its contributions to medicine, education, and cultural understanding. The true conclusion of this epic history is that while the shadow of the dagger has faded into legend, the substance of the spirit, forged in adversity, tested by fire, and redeemed by choice, endures. It stands as a powerful testament to the idea that the most revolutionary act is not the seizure of power, but the courage to redefine it, that the most enduring legacy is not written in the blood of enemies, but in the hope offered to future generations. The chapter of the assassins is closed, but the story of the community they became continues, a vibrant and hopeful narrative written not in stone and steel, but in the ongoing project of human progress.